One of the reasons why I think strength training, regardless of intensity, may provide cognitive gains is that there is a lot of motor learning involved. To put it in parallel to walking or running is not a second nature. There is a lot more to think about. So I think when people are continually exercising, if their goal is to, maintain or continue to induce cognitive health, is that, I do think changing it up does matter.
Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
This episode is brought to you by the Resistance Exercise Conference, the science and application of strength training for health and human performance. Would you like to learn from the top strength training researchers, network and connect with other exercise professionals from all over the world, join a welcome reception on a Friday night to build relationships with other strength training professionals, experience an early morning workout from an expert trainer to kickstart your Saturday, and get inspired, rejuvenated, and focused on your strength training business? I certainly do, and that is why I am attending and interviewing all of the speakers at the event. The Resistance Exercise Conference will be held on the 9th and 10th of March 2018 in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the Commons Hotel. To get 10% off your entry fee, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com, click the registration button, and enter Corporate Warrior 10 in the promo code field in PayPal. I'm very excited about this and have wanted to attend for years. Sign up now at resistanceexerciseconference.com and get 10% off with promo code Corporate Warrior 10, and I look forward to meeting you in person. This episode is brought to you by ARX, the most innovative, efficient, and effective all-in-one exercise machines I've ever seen. I was really impressed with my ARX workout. The intensity and adaptive resistance was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love how the machine enables you to increase the negative load to fatigue target muscles more quickly, and I love how the workouts are effortlessly quantified. The software tracks maximum force output, rate of work, total amount of work done, and more in front of you on screen, allowing you to compete with your previous performance to give you and your clients real-time motivation. The ARX uses a computer-controlled motor to give you the exact amount of resistance your clients need 100% of the time. This means that the resistance can never become dangerous, is intuitive and simple to use, and can provide you with all the results you and your clients are looking for in a fraction of the time. ARX is highly effective and efficient in delivering all of the benefits of exercise, including increased strength, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, bone mineral density, and injury recovery. As well as being utilized by many high-intensity training trainers to deliver highly effective and efficient workouts to their clients, ARX comes highly recommended by world-class trainers and brands, including Bulletproof, Tony Robbins, and Ben Greenfield Fitness. To find out more about ARX and how you can get $1,000 off software licensing when you place an order, that's right guys, $1,000 off, please go to arxfit.com and mention Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. So again, to get $1,000 off software licensing when you order, head on over to arxfit.com and enter Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. Hi guys, I am Lawrence Neal and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior, the podcast that teaches you how to optimize your high-intensity training protocol and your high-intensity training business to help you achieve your health, fitness, and business goals. My former guests include people like Dr. Sean Baker, Tim Ryan, Mark Sisson, Ben Greenfield, Ted Harrison, Dr. Chris Scott, Andy Magnus, and many, many more. My next guest is Dr. Teresa LiuAmbrose, whose name I hope I have pronounced correctly. Teresa is a professor, physical therapist, and Canada Research Chair at the University of British Columbia. She directs one of Canada's leading research programs on aging, which has a really long URL, which is too hard to remember here, so I will add it to the show notes on the blog at corporatewarrior.org. Teresa is known internationally for her work in randomized controlled trials of exercise with cognitive and mobility outcomes in older adults. She's pioneered studies to address competing questions regarding the efficacy of exercise, particularly resistance training, on cognitive health. Her work has received international attention and featured widely by the media, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Wall Street Journal. Having reviewed the literature myself, I asked Teresa a lot of questions in relation to the specific resistance training protocols used within the trials to try and identify what mediators are key for best results in terms of frequency, intensity, load, etc. We discussed the potential benefits of walking and or frequent movement alongside resistance training or exercise in relation to cognitive health. We talk about how she's able to control studies to really know what improves cognitive health. We talk about compliance. How do we get more people engaged in exercise? And Teresa explains some of the mechanisms in terms of how exercise improves brain health. And we talk about much, much more than that. So for all the show notes and links for this episode and all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.org and don't forget to wait at the end for your free gift. And now I give you Dr. Teresa LiuAmbrose. Teresa, thank you for joining me on Corporate Warrior today. Really appreciate having you on my show. So I kind of wanted to kick off with some questions about obviously a lot of the studies that you've done in terms of the impact that resistance training has on like cognitive health. And one of the questions that Skylar Tanner is a big fan of yours, and also been on my show before and is a friend of mine. He has submitted this question, which I thought was really good, which is, why does the research community at large continue to place resistance training at a lower tier when it comes to improving cognitive function in older trainees?
Yeah, no, that's a fabulous question. And in many ways, that's sort of why I started looking at resistance training, because it actually is a clear void. I think there's many reasons. One is that animal models. So much of what we do in terms of studies to look at how exercise of any type may impact the brain, we're limited when we are working with humans, in the sense that we can't directly access the brain. But certainly within animal models, we can train them, then we can, do many things to them that we can't with humans to better understand what is happening in addition to the behavior that we can observe within the animals. So within animal models, the aerobic based training is really well designed, right? But for strength training, it's actually a very difficult model to design for animals. And I think that in part has fed into the specific focus on aerobic training, because we do understand the more biologics behind it, because we do have the animal models to back it up. That said, I would, in the recent years, there has been, I think, a growing interest in looking at resistance training in animal models, but they aren't perfect, but it certainly is more demonstrated effort and interest than in past years. I think the other piece is that when people intuitively think about exercise in the brain, they automatically default to blood flow, right? So I would say a lot of times when I speak with people about as to why exercise generally would have an impact, right away, most people kind of default to the fact that when you exercise, especially aerobically, you're increasing blood flow to the brain, which, can't be a bad thing, because blood obviously carries the nutrients that the brain needs, and therefore that's a very direct and sort of, I guess, commonsensical reason as to why aerobic training may be preferred. So I think, there's that sort of guttural linkage, as well as, what we do know from animal models on a consistent level.
Good stuff. Because it's my understanding that, and certainly you've shown this in some of the work you've been involved in, is that resistance training and other forms of exercise can actually enlarge, the hippocampus and other areas of the brain. So there seems to be far more going on than just like blood flow, like people default to. There seems to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we begin to better understand how exercise, and again, of various types, and I agree, it probably is beyond just aerobic. The multitude of benefits that it can sort of directly or indirectly benefit the brain is quite actually impressive. So in addition to, as you mentioned, the blood flow, but studies are showing changes in actual brain structure, whether it's the amount of brain matter or the integrity of the structure, as well as sort of thickness. And then in addition to using functional MRI, how the brain literally functions within a certain sort of stimuli or environment. So it actually is responsive at multiple layers, and aside from just simply blood flow.
In one study, you talked about how resistance training improved cognition versus low intensity training, which only maintained it, I suppose, which is better than it regressing.
Yes.
Why is it that resistance training seems to be more effective than kind of low intensity exercise, in your opinion?
That's a great question. So I think intensity does matter within the context of how much benefit you can reap from exercise. And I guess I do want to, saying that though, I still want to caution that we actually don't know if there is a threshold by which is too intense, because most studies to date has been of lower intensity or moderate intensity. And it's only now that we're really looking at the higher intensities. And we're certainly doing a study of that nature with collaborators from Australia. But I think of the higher intent or of the moderate intensities versus lower intensities, that when we think about how exercise brings us about benefit to the brain, they're typically tied to what we call physiological cascades. So to release these cascades, you need to hit a certain threshold to trigger the cascade as a response, right? So if you're doing your usual stuff, you're not going to respond, whether that's your muscles or your bones. If you're always doing the same thing, let's say, again, just go back to a very simple reference, such as, your muscles. If you're always doing the same thing, you're not going to get stronger. Your muscles are not going to respond. Right? But if you increase and make the stimuli greater than what you're used to, then yes, there's the physiological response that we typically know about, and you do start seeing differences in muscle fiber, strength, and etc. That's the same thing with the brain, I do believe, when it comes to sort of the different biological cascades that needs to occur to see the central benefits. And as well, even from a physical health perspective, right? We know even for aerobic training, certain intensities does matter if you are trying to, let's say, improve your cardiovascular profile.
That's interesting. I'm just curious, when you mentioned testing with moderate and high intensity exercise, would you be able to elaborate on what exactly that means from a protocol point of view?
Sure. In regards to resistance training, or
Yes.
in regards to, okay. Yeah. So that's actually now more of a question that's more difficult to answer. But I think traditionally we typically, with a higher intensity, where we are talking about higher loading, lower reps, and to exhaustion. While for moderate intensity, it really has been looking at more longer or greater number of reps within the set before you fatigue. So typically the intensity piece traditionally has been kind of categorically defined as such. But now it seems that it's really about whether you reach fatigue or not, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that is actually a really interesting notion now. Whether does it really matter about the weight that you lift until you reach fatigue, whether that's quickly or, through a longer duration to reach that fatigue to get that muscle gain, which I think is related to why we think strength training would benefit the brain. But I guess to answer your question briefly, I would categorically put higher intensity as those that of higher loading, of lower reps, potentially with greater speed as well, while the moderate intensity typically is of longer or of greater repetition per set to fatigue, and not as, sort of more at an equal speed eccentrically and concentrically.
Okay, so both moderate and high intensity would both be to muscle fatigue, where the participant can't really do any more work. So they go to all momentary muscular failure. Is that correct?
Yeah, muscular failure. Yeah, which I think if the end goal is to increase muscle strength, you do need to get to that failure level.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Like a lot of my listeners and myself, will partake in high intensity strength training. So generally that looks like, single set to failure, maybe working out once, twice, or maximum 3 times per week. And I think they'll be listening to this going, is my workout superior to, say, someone who does a more conventional strength training workout where they're doing multiple sets and maybe more volume? And I'm trying not to let my kind of cognitive bias get the better of me, but is it fair to kind of like hypothesize that actually a more intense workout, like I just described, could be more effective for brain health and cognitive health?
I think that's the question that still needs to be addressed, and I don't know if within a clinical study whether we would be able to do it at a level where it could be representative of the general older adults, if that makes any sense. So with older adults with strength training, we typically also deliver at most a moderate, what we call more traditional strength training paradigm because of safety reasons. So not so much, aside from the potential strain, but, most do come with pre-existing musculoskeletal issues, and most are novice, or actually all are novice strength trainers, right? So there is a lot to be taught. So I think if we were to, if a study was to look at high versus, of a traditional / moderate, they would probably be needing to target people who have some history of strength training. But then there's a bit of a bias in there too, right? Because typically we like to see people who haven't been training for specifically within that type of exercise, so that it's a new intervention, and then we can determine whether by implementing the training you can detect a change in cognition.
Just to jump back to a point you made earlier about it could be potentially important to increase the difficulty over time of the exercise protocol.
Yes.
I'm just trying to think about this from a high intensity training perspective. Is, again, listeners will be doing, they'll be trying to improve from workout to workout, as in they'll be trying to either lift more weight or exercise for longer, so have a longer kind of time under load or volume. Is that enough, do you think, in terms of going about inducing these types of, that cascade that you mentioned earlier? Is that really important, do you think?
I think it's important, but I think it's also important to think about doing the exercises in a different way to introduce some novelty of the motor patterns as well. Right. So I one of the reasons why I think strength training, regardless of intensity, may provide cognitive gains is that it is, if you're doing it well, there is a lot of motor learning involved, right? It's not as, I guess, to put it in parallel to walking or running, is not a second nature, unless again, you've been training and you kind of know all the nuances and, where to stabilize as you lift, and, even the breathing patterns, etc. There is a lot more to think about as you do the exercises versus, just trying to increase your pace or increase the pace of your run or walk. So I think when people are continually exercising, if their goal is to, maintain or continue to induce cognitive health, is that, I do think changing it up does matter. And this goes back to the more sort of broader theory of, introducing novelty, learning, all those components do matter when it comes to cognitive health. Certainly physical health matters a lot, but, there is all that sort of enrichment principles that can be incorporated, I think, in exercise training if you're thoughtful about it.
Interesting. So there's a good argument there for having some variety from a cognitive health perspective, which makes sense in terms of I've heard you talk about before about, motor learning and skill learning and how they can improve cognitive health. Cool. Okay. I'm just looking through, I've got a bunch of hair splitting questions about resistance training that I will probably skip over. Okay, so there was this study that I believe it was your group did. It's called High and Low Intensity Exercise Does Not Improve Cognitive Function After a Stroke.
Oh, yes.
Right? And it was interesting because you guys used high intensity aerobics to see if that would make any difference, and it didn't. It wasn't statistically significant. Could it be that a resistance training protocol might actually offer more benefit and might actually be worthwhile? And is there any studies to show that, or coming out in the future perhaps on that?
Yeah, so specifically within stroke, one of the reasons I think that strength training hasn't been looked at as specifically as aerobic training, again, multiple reasons, but perhaps I'll talk about two. One is that because you've had a stroke, typically your cardiovascular health is quite at risk or compromised. That's why you develop the stroke, whether you had, diabetes or some other chronic conditions. That said, I also do recognize that resistance training does have benefits for cardiovascular health, and I don't want to minimize it. I'm just talking about sort of what is popularly known. The other piece is more from a practical implementation piece. So if someone does have a fair amount of physical impairment from the stroke, the strength training piece does need a lot more modification. And sometimes you're kind of fighting against the spasms and such. So there are definitely more challenges in delivering a purely resistance training program for those who've suffered a stroke. So typically in the rehab world, it's a bit of a combination. You do want to maximize the strength wherever possible, but you do augment it with some type of mobility and aerobic base as well. That study in itself, which really was led by my colleague, is novel in the sense that in the past, and again, this may be deviating a little bit away from the focus, but in speaking to higher intensity, is that it wasn't viewed to be safe actually after chronic stroke. And what she's really shown is that it is quite safe and it does provide lots of benefits. In this particular study, we didn't see much evidence for cognitive benefits, but she definitely has demonstrated that it has other benefits that and also at the same time being quite safe.
Are there any other exercise protocols aside from aerobic exercise, low intensity, you could call it, or resistance training that you feel are effective for improving cognitive health? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Well, right now the whole the high intensity interval training, which is again aerobic based typically, is gaining a lot of interest as to whether it would be beneficial, and certainly has the perceived benefit that you can get the maximum benefit for the minimum amount of time, so therefore you may get better compliance, and as well as that huge rush of doing the high sort of intensity trainings, that that sort of endorphins and all that feel good components are so immediate that it actually feed into your motivation to do the next session. So there is a lot of discussions within, I guess, research about those aspects, and that is again one of the strategies we're now looking at as to whether it may be quite beneficial for individuals with some cognitive issues.
Okay, cool. You've done other literature to show or other studies, I should say, to show the benefits of walking. I think it's 3 times per week, and how that can improve cognitive health. I just wondered. I couldn't find any literature on this, but do you feel there'd be even greater cognitive benefit if you combined resistance training and you did plenty of walking? Or is there like a law of diminishing returns with this kind of thing?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. That's actually one of the studies we're launching right now. So believe it or not, there hasn't really been a study that's sort of specifically looked at that. So there's studies that, as you noted, looks a lot at aerobic training, and some studies looking at different intensities within aerobic training. For resistance training, we've looked at, the same intensity but different frequencies. But there really hasn't been one study that's looked at, aerobic versus resistance versus a combined training. And as you say, whether it would give you, let's say, greater gains, or it may be diminished returns for the amount of time you're training. And so that's something we're actually examining right now, and we're pretty excited about it. Yeah, and we're doing quite a bit of more mechanistic outcomes to better understand the underlying pathways, because right now it is hypothesized that for aerobic and resistance training is that they probably do have some different underlying pathways by which each brings about benefits to the brain, but we actually still, again, don't have a great understanding, so that's something that we're pursuing quite heavily.
Are you able to elaborate on, and maybe like you were just alluding to there, maybe mechanistically there's still so much we don't understand, but are you able to elaborate on like how resistance training, I think I might have asked this in a way just now, but how, it does benefit the brain, from like a mechanistic point of view, like which parts of the brain it improves or...
Yeah, sure. So right now, in terms of, again, what we know in general of how the exercise directly benefits the brain, growth factors is really a main sort of, main ingredient or pathway that we're all very interested in. So growth factors are basically, amino acid chains that really at the end of the day, once they do enter into the brain, promotes neuronal growth, survival, differentiation, and other types of growth factors may also promote blood vessel growth and differentiation, which is all good, right? Versus cell death. And we do know from animal models that when you do train aerobically, you release this one specifically called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, so BDNF. And BDNF is probably the most steady growth factor. With strength training, it's hypothesized it's probably more related to IGF-1. So we know IGF-1 is produced both peripherally and probably can cross the blood-brain barrier as well. And in one of the few animal studies that has tried to look at both aerobic and resistance training, that's what they basically found, is that it seems to be that with aerobic training, it tends to increase BDNF levels, while strength training tends to increase IGF-1 levels. And that potentially has some implications if we really are thoughtful about, prescribing in the future at a precise level. So another big thing nowadays is sort of precision medicine, or based on perhaps on your sort of individual preferences, but also your genetic makeup. And there are genetic variations that exist that may actually decrease someone's ability to gain the benefits of, let's say, a release of BDNF. So if that's the case, in a very sort of, broad strokes hypothesis way, it may be that for these people, then resistance training might be a better mode, right? Because genetically, they may have just a reduced response to the releases of BDNF. So maybe they would be better with a pathway or an exercise that targets a pathway that's not related to BDNF. So that's a lot of the reasons as to why we want to better understand the mechanisms, is that, moving forward, if we want to personalize exercise prescription, we need to understand how each type of exercise targets the brain.
Cool. And going back to what we were talking about, this might be a really stupid question actually, but I feel like I have to ask it. So, you were talking about obviously, walking regularly can improve cognitive health, and then the potential of maybe combining that with something like, a safe resistance training program. Now, is it just as good to say that someone is moving frequently? So, Okay.
Yeah, no, I completely understand your question, because I asked that question to one of my students during his thesis proposal. So I guess maybe if I can just clarify your question. So there is there's also a lot of talk about, if you're physically active, it's a strategy for aging well, regardless. And lots of the public messaging is about moving as much as possible. So whether it's walking, 2 blocks, or taking the stairs, etc. versus, I guess, some of the discussions we've had, which is really about intensity, which is different, right? And so I guess first to clarify, when we have done the studies on walking, it is still monitored at an intensity. So it was still targeted at moderate intensity once they were, sort of trained up to safely to reach those levels. So it wasn't just per se a walk of self-pace. It was a walk that was predetermined based on their heart rate and fitness levels. So I guess what I would say is that what we do know in terms of just a general physically active lifestyle, so that's a sort of targeted purposeful exercise type of approach. Much of that data comes from sort of what we call large studies, where we don't specifically give people an exercise program. We simply observe them, and then we basically follow them over time. And it's in those studies that we generally see those who are more physically active on a day-to-day, they have a lesser risk of developing dementia over time. And what we know from exercise, which is more a subcategory of physical activity, but defined as, with purpose and typically of specific intensity and workload, etc. Those are the studies that we do that we see that when you intervene specifically and do these purposeful exercises, we see the actual changes in the brain and also as well as in behavior. What we are missing across the different type of studies and data is that whether targeted exercise training of certain intensity or type can actually over time reduce dementia, and because we simply don't follow people for a long enough time or give them the exercises and monitor them long enough. So I guess in a way to answer your original question is that I don't think we quite know, simply because we don't have the same type of rigorous data from these large observational studies, because again, they're just observational. We can only control very little versus, the intervention studies, which we control a lot more because we basically regulate what they do versus what they don't do. And we see these effects. Unfortunately, we don't follow them for long enough time to figure out if then they have a lesser risk of, cognitive impairment. Okay. So I think it's just, I guess I'm just trying to separate where we are seeing the evidence and the limitations of each type. Yeah.
Yeah. But it just seems like, based on the findings you have so far and based on what I've learned reading your work, that a really good recommendation to people is do resistance training and then move all the time. It's just a very simple heuristic for people to kind of follow.
Yep. No, it is. And I think the message is very simple, actually. And what you just stated really does align with the recommendations of the Global Council for Brain Health. Okay. So last year, they basically invited a group of experts, and I was fortunate enough to be part of that panel where we reviewed the evidence, again, both from, interventional studies and what we call population-based studies. And that basically really was a recommendation. There's two components to aging well in terms of cognitively well, as well as that, to remain active when you can throughout the day. So don't sit as much and be generally active. But the other piece is also to partake in resistance training and aerobic training. So 3 times for the aerobic, at least twice for the resistance training. Mm-hmm. And that really was a general recommendation for cognitive health.
Yeah, no, there's other factors like nutrition and sleep, but I just wanted to focus on your expertise in this one.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's interesting that there was one study you did where you had people do resistance training in like a group setting. And you even mentioned in a YouTube video that you are aware that, the results can often be conflated with the joy and motivation and kind of those subjective measures, and there's other things, there's other variables.
Yes.
How are you controlling for that going forward in future studies?
Yeah. So, I guess that's a great, comment. And so, the socializing piece is huge. We know from the literature, that when older adults are engaged with others, they actually do age better. So in our own studies, in both past and future studies, how we control for it is that for the comparator group. So for those people who are not in the resistance training group, they're also put in a group setting. So everyone who's in this study are placed in a group-based exercise type of training. So even though everyone is doing different types of exercises, lighter, heavier, etc., they all have equal exposure to their peers and opportunities to form new friendships and social ties, really. So in many ways, we are controlling for it by ensuring that it's equal across everybody in this study.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting how that has such a big impact on cognitive health, potentially that social aspect. Sorry, you're going to comment?
Oh, yeah. No, I think it's actually huge. And I think sometimes, when we're not in late life just yet, we don't quite fully appreciate it because most of our lives are so full. We don't really, feel the lack of people around you, or if anything is probably too much, too many emails, too many of this. But for older adults, especially for those who, are fortunate enough to age, fairly well, it does their social circle really does shrink quite a bit over time, and especially after certain age groups. So I think overall this is where exercise in itself is so helpful, because it has the physical benefits, but it really provides a lot of the mental benefits as well.
Awesome. Jumping back to a study you actually mentioned earlier, it was the How Much Will Older Adults Exercise, a feasibility study of aerobic training combined with resistance exercise. And that was one that you published this year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Now, that had the group, it's group-based, and they were doing aerobic training, I think it was twice a week, and resistance training twice a week. So it's quite a lot, and difficult to expect the general population to comply with that type of frequency, I think. And I just think, is it really necessary? Like, could you not have do you think you would have got just as good outcomes in terms of cognitive health with just resistance training? Do you really feel like the aerobic training augments that in a big way?
I don't know. That's the reason why we're going to do this study. So that study you just cited is actually what our pilot work, just to see, as you say, will older adults even be open to the notion of training 4 days a week? And we actually found that they were quite open to it. I do think for older adults, as long as it's, delivered in a positive manner, very often it's it's like a positive feedback loop, I guess, in relation to resistance training. That's where I probably see it the most. So in our earlier studies of resistance training, they were all done with older women only. And the reason for that is because there is some suggestion that men and women actually respond quite differently to exercise in relation to cognitive benefits. And I have to say the things that we observed but didn't measure or could really scientifically report was sort of the empowerment a lot of these older women felt with strength training. I think it's not typical, at least, 10 years ago when I was working with that sort of generation, I suppose it was really quite, an exercise in building their own confidence and self-efficacy. So above and beyond sort of the physical and the cognitive outcomes, as individuals who worked with them on a daily basis, how it really changed their own viewpoint of themselves was truly impressive. And I do think that piece of the resistance training is actually rather unique, because again, you don't quite think of older adults, especially older women, lifting weights. I think that perception is changing, and I'm glad it's changing. But I think just from from what the traditional views were. And it really, was just all I can say was quite an empowering experience for all of them. And they really enjoyed it. And that was great for us because, obviously if they enjoy it, they adhere to the program. So
did you not feel that men have the same response?
I think, and again, I can only say based on, my own experiences with the older, with men, I think it's a little bit different. I think, they are traditionally, again, most men, probably view themselves as being strong, right? Mm-hmm. So I do think when they engage in exercise and as such, perhaps there isn't as much of this, self-empowerment, even though I trust there is a component of that, but I do think to a different degree for women, because it is about, perhaps fighting stereotypes, right? And you're the individual who's actually breaking those molds is pretty, impressive when you're that person who can impress upon your grandson that, you're strong and capable. And that's sort of some of the feedback we heard is that, well, my grandson said to me, wow, you have muscles, it's just a very, sincere and positive, an organic experience. And again, I'm sure men can certainly experience all that too, but I just don't know because of the cultural biases we have, whether it would be as impressive for them as individuals. I hope so, but I haven't heard, at least in our conversations, similar sort of feelings of, wow, someone said this to me.
Good stuff. Is there any plans to do, because I noticed that most of these studies are focused on older population, and I appreciate why that is because that's where I guess a lot of the decline in cognitive health comes with aging. But I just wondered, is there any plans or have you done any work with younger populations on the effects of, exercise on cognitive health?
Yeah, and that's actually an excellent question. And that's something we actually are trying to do. We just recently put in a grant. So the age group that we're hoping to now to really target is midlife. So there, in terms of cognitive health and exercise, there is a huge body of literature, as I'm sure you're aware, in children and in adolescents, and of course in older adults. But what is actually missing is the midlife span, which is unfortunate because as we now understand how the brain ages and what puts you at risk for, cognitive impairment, midlife is a critical period. So you developing hypertension or type 2 diabetes in midlife is actually much more impactful on your brain health than if you developed it in later life.
Yeah.
And I think in part because, your brain is exposed to this chronic condition for much longer. So, and we also do recognize even for something like Alzheimer's disease, it's a condition that really transpires over probably 20 years before the clinical onset. So midlife, I think, is a critical window, and Absolutely. It hasn't been sort of an age group that's been targeted as much within the context of cognitive health. But if we're really going to be sincere about prevention and sort of strategies that really give people the best chance, I do think we need to back up. And that's something we are trying to work towards now. I think and I think this is where much of the higher intensity protocols may be of huge relevance because, again, shorter time, potentially equal gains, and perhaps then as a result, better adherence. So I think, sometimes when we talk about intensities, I think we do need to take in relation to the individual in terms of their time, their capacity, their physical health. And I think, again, going back for older adults, it's always been more traditionally on the moderate intensity, not so much because we don't think the higher intensity would work, but it's a balance between safety, feasibility, and what's acceptable. But I really do think for the midlife span, that's where the higher intensities may really have great utility, and it's worth examining for sure.
What is your personal exercise regimen?
Mine is very West Coast. I have a black dog who's actually sitting beside me right now, Black Lab. So we run together quite a bit, and I do some strength training, but not of the high intensity, just a very, modest version. But I enjoy it. So, I'm able to keep it up. So that's what I do. But yeah, my dog is probably my best fitness coach. Yeah.
How often do you do like strength training? How many times?
Yeah, that's for me is twice a week because it is about getting to the gym, and then the running is usually 3 to 4 times because I don't know if you've ever been to Vancouver or UBC, but we're really fortunate. The campus is just nested within this huge forest, really, with beautiful trails. So yeah, lots of faculty run because it's just super convenient. And again, going back to what I mentioned about midlife and what is feasible. This is where, short bouts may be really what would be really helpful in getting people active. Because I know for myself, I do what I do because it is the most convenient. Yeah.
I've got a couple of rapid fire questions. The answers don't have to be rapid fire.
Okay.
What have you changed your mind about in the last year in relation to exercise and cognitive health?
What have I changed? Not much other than I think there's a lot more. Well, yeah, there's a lot more to be studied than what I previously thought, actually, because I think as we keep moving forward and we and myself and colleagues do more work, I think it's really quite impressive the impact exercise can have. It's just so, in some ways it's so simple, but yet so powerful. And I think the research is really showing that more and more. So it's really an exciting time, whereby I think, we're really gaining that traction and the recognition that exercises can be really quite therapeutic and we need to better understand it so we can maximize it.
Cool. Tell me something that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on.
Something that's true that almost nobody agrees with me on, really? I don't know if there is such a thing, actually. That is true, but no one agrees. I think I'm easygoing, but no one agrees with me on that. But I think it's true. How's that?
I can't accept that no. That's fine. If there's nothing that comes to mind, I can move on to the next question.
Nothing comes to mind. Yeah.
Okay. This is you're going to hate me for this because it's quite similar. Is there anything that you believe to be true but you can't prove it currently?
Something I believe that is true. But
again, that kind of pertains to the cognitive health and exercise would be interesting.
Yeah. That's true. I think a lot. Yeah. So I think what I've alluded to is that I do think the future is about, especially if we're going to talk about prescribing exercise for those with established pathology or disease, I do think we do need to move forward to deliver it in a precise manner. And I think what I see in my conversations is that people are very much into the precision, or personalized medicine when it comes to cancer and, other conditions. But for whatever reason, when it comes to exercise, people really poo-poo it as a strategy that can be personalized. And I disagree. Yeah. And I do think that as we better understand the mechanisms and also the interactions with people's genetic makeup, that we will actually realize that there are ways to better prescribe for maximum efficacy.
Cool. If you could make one ask or request for people listening to this, what would that be in terms of, I guess, recommendations?
Again, I think we probably touched upon it, is that if you're really serious about your cognitive health, it is about starting early. My analogy is that if you wanted the best retirement plan, again, same advice, you start early and do bouts of it regularly. Alzheimer's, any sort of dementia does not start the minute you hit 65. It's probably been happening for the last 20 years. So, take time for yourself, even when things seem really busy and, you just can't spare another 5 minutes. Maybe take some of the, advice, or probably some of what you've been trying to say is that, them is like 5 minutes of, short bout of exercise is still better than nothing. And I do believe that is true.
Awesome. That's really interesting. And what's the best way for people to find out more about you, Teresa, and what you're up to? Social handles or email or?
We have a lab website. I think I perhaps share that with you in my bio. But our lab website basically provides an update on all our studies and sort of all our milestones.
Do you know the domain off the top of your head, the URL for that?
No, I should, but I don't.
I'm going to read it out because some people who listen to this may not go to the show notes. So I will put a blog post up with all of the show notes and all of the links. But
sure.
You just got to get those people that might not act. So just give me a second.
I'm sure you would.
I shall read it out to the listeners. So, okay, is it the domain? Is it foolsclinic.ca? Is that the one? Or?
No, that's our other one.
Cogmob. That one.
Yeah.
So
that's right,
cogmob.rehab.med.ubc.ca. So that's going to be hard for people to remember. So you're better off just going to corporatewarrior.org and going to the show notes and then clicking the link.
See, there you go.
That's it. Cool. So to everyone listening, to find all the show notes, the studies that me and Teresa have discussed, and everything else, go to corporatewarrior.org, and you'll also find links to all of the other episodes I've done there as well. And that's it. So thanks very much, Teresa. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks.
No worries. And until next time, guys, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Before you head off, head on over to corpwarrior.com to get your free ebook with 6 interview transcripts of some of my top guests, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Bay, and Bill Day Simone, on how to optimize muscle gain, fat loss, and overall health in an efficient, effective, and sustainable way. These transcripts are not verbatim, deliberately. Instead, they've been transcribed in an easy read format to make it more enjoyable and easier for you to quickly pick out what you need and start getting results. To get your ebook, head on over to corpwarrior.com, that's CORP warrior.com, and enter your email address. Then check your email for an email from me with a confirmation link. Once you click the link, you will be instantly redirected to a PDF version of the transcripts. This episode is brought to you by ARX, the most innovative, efficient, and effective all-in-one exercise machines I've ever seen. I was really impressed with my ARX workout. The intensity and adaptive resistance was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I love how the machine enables you to increase the negative load to fatigue target muscles more quickly, and I love how the workouts are effortlessly quantified. The software tracks maximum force output, rate of work, total amount of work done, and more in front of you on screen, allowing you to compete with your previous performance to give you and your clients real-time motivation. The ARX uses a computer-controlled motor to give you the exact amount of resistance your clients need 100% of the time. This means that the resistance can never become dangerous, is intuitive and simple to use, and can provide you with all the results you and your clients are looking for in a fraction of the time. ARX is highly effective and efficient in delivering all of the benefits of exercise, including increased strength, muscle mass, cardiovascular conditioning, bone mineral density, and injury recovery. As well as being utilized by many high-intensity training trainers to deliver highly effective and efficient workouts to their clients, ARX comes highly recommended by world-class trainers and brands, including Bulletproof, Tony Robbins, and Ben Greenfield Fitness. To find out more about ARX and how you can get $1,000 off software licensing when you place an order, that's right guys, $1,000 off, please go to arxfit.com and mention Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. So again, to get $1,000 off software licensing when you order, head on over to arxfit.com and enter Corporate Warrior in the How Did You Hear About Us field. This episode is brought to you by the Resistance Exercise Conference, the science and application of strength training for health and human performance. Would you like to learn from the top strength training researchers, network and connect with other exercise professionals from all over the world, join a welcome reception on a Friday night to build relationships with other strength training professionals, experience an early morning workout from an expert trainer to kickstart your Saturday, and get inspired, rejuvenated, and focused on your strength training business? I certainly do, and that is why I am attending and interviewing all of the speakers at the event. The Resistance Exercise Conference will be held on the 9th and 10th of March 2018 in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the Commons Hotel. To get 10% off your entry fee, head on over to resistanceexerciseconference.com, click the registration button, and enter Corporate Warrior 10 in the promo code field in PayPal. I'm very excited about this and have wanted to attend for years. Sign up now at resistanceexerciseconference.com and get 10% off with promo code Corporate Warrior 10, and I look forward to meeting you in person.